Okay, this presentation will look at several aspects of the CAPE syllabus. For example, we're going to look at biotic and abiotic factors. We're going to look at tolerance ranges and fundamental unrealized niches. But to begin with, what's the difference between biotic and abiotic factors? And the answer is, well, biotic factors are living things such as fungi, plants, protists, animals, archaea, which are kind of primitive bacteria. And archaea are very different from bacteria. In fact, they really belong to a separate super kingdom because bacteria are much closer to eukaryotes than they are to archaea. And therefore, we really say that archaea really belong to their own separate super kingdom. Abiotic factors are things such as air, salinity, soil, temperature, light, water, minerals, pH, humidity. Those are some examples. I suppose another thing I could mention, things such as feces is organic in nature and probably contains bacteria and so on. In fact, feces is largely bacteria, and therefore feces would be considered biotic. So, what's the objective we're looking at in this class? And the answer is the relationship between living organisms and their environment. And we've got to look at biotic and abiotic environments, tolerance ranges and limiting factors, and ecological niches. And we're going to look at what is called a fundamental niche and a realized niche. So, what are biotic and abiotic factors? Well, there are two components of an ecosystem. Biotic factors are the living things like plants, animals, and fungi. Abiotic factors are the non-living things like air, soil, water, and sunlight. Every ecosystem includes both biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic factors determine the type of life that lives in the ecosystem. So abiotic factors will determine what living things can be present in an ecosystem. But after that, once living things go into an ecosystem, they're going to modify the ecosystem, and that too will determine what can live there. Large trees, for example, provide shade and will keep the underground ground land a bit more moist, and this will alter what things can live there. So, biotic factors are any organism in an ecosystem. Basically, if you see it in the kingdom of life, it's the biotic factors. So, biotic factors include plants, animals, algae, fungi, lichens, bacteria, and protists. Specific examples include humans, trees, grass, cats, E. coli, that's a bacterium, frogs, and mushrooms. One way of classifying biotic factors is by their nutritional needs. So you have to pay attention to these. So we can classify them as producers or autotrophs, and these make their own food from biotic factors. The most common way is photosynthesis, which converts carbon dioxide and water and sunlight into sugar and glucose. Plants, algae, and some protists are producers. We can also call them photoautotrophs because they make their food using light. You have another type called chemoautotrophs, which get their energy from chemicals and use it to make, again, sugar and glucose and so on. Then you have consumers or heterotrophs. And consumers or heterotrophs get their nutrients by eating producers and or other consumers. And herbivores, like cattle, only feed on producers. And carnivores, like wolves and cats, only feed on consumers. And omnivores, like humans and dogs, consume both producers and consumers. I suppose we usually consider dogs to be carnivores. You'll notice dogs will eat other things besides flesh. So I suppose you can consider them omnivores, as this thing has them. But it'd be probably better to consider a dog to be a carnivore. If you consider its dentition, for example, its teeth are adapted for eating flesh. Then we have decomposers or detritivores. Decomposers are heterotrophs that do not make their own food. Distinction is that they digest compounds made by producers and consumers. Food sources for decomposers include dead and decaying producers and consumers, and the waste products are made by living organisms. Examples of decomposers are fungi, earthworms, and certain bacteria. We can also consider scavengers as decomposers. Scavengers are such as a jonquil or vulture. Consider that really to be a decomposer. Then abiotic factors are non-living parts of an ecosystem, and examples of biotic factors. So an example of abiotic factors include sunlight, air and wind, water, soil, rocks and minerals, temperature, pH, gravity, tides, natural events. And abiotic factors affect biotic factors, plus they influence other abiotic factors. For example, a drought will influence the amount of water in an ecosystem, and the pH affects how minerals break down and nutrients are available within the ecosystem. So one abiotic factor can affect another one. If a soil becomes acid, the level of minerals will decrease. Um, if there's a drought, which is a weather condition, there will be less water present. And I suppose things such as rainfall could affect the structure of the soil and so on. Rain can cause soil erosion, for example. So abiotic factors can affect each other. So now that we've seen the difference between biotic and abiotic factors, let's identify them. For example, consider an aquarium that contains fish and plants. Biotic factors with things like fish, plants, bacteria, algae, waste released by the fish, and fish food. And this comes to a point I just made a minute ago. Fish urine and feces and fish food is not exactly alive, but it's organic, and it also contains bacteria and viruses as well. So we can usually consider it as biotic, although it's not alive. And the abiotic factors in the aquarium are the water, the pH and minerals within the water, the container, the rock, sand, or whatever is at the bottom of the tank, filtration media, air, will be air in the water, temperature and light. Another example would be a small house plant but we're not. You can think for yourself the biotic and abiotic factors on a house plant. After that, we have limiting factors. What is the limiting factor? It is a biotic or abiotic factor that restricts growth of an ecosystem. And the next thing is important. At any given time, there is only one limiting factor. So there might be a few in short supply, but only one of them is going to be limiting. So the next point is also important. The limiting factor often changes. For example, consider an ecosystem where a plant grows on a windowsill. What one factor determines the plant's health? Usually the amount of water the plant receives. Over time, the limiting factor changes, perhaps becoming the amount of light a plant receives, or the nutrients in its soil. The amount of light, I suppose, especially in temperate countries, where you have long winters, and if the light in the room isn't on much, then light would certainly become a limiting factor. As another, as another example, consider the rainforest floor. And you know, the rainforest floor is usually fairly dark because they have tall trees above it and a large amount of leaves and so on. So little light actually reaches the floor. So usually the limiting factor is the amount of sunlight that reaches the surface through the tree canopy. Plants compete for this light, and animals depend on the success of the plants. So if the plants can't get enough light to make food, it will affect the animals. And fungi thrive on the moisture and the limited light. So if you have a heavy canopy, so the bottom of the forest floor is dark and damp, then fungi will thrive. In the dry season, the limiting factor may change to the amount of rainfall that falls, or temperature may rise or drop and become a limiting factor. So limiting factors in an ecosystem will change. They're not going to be static. And then after that, we can look at tolerance ranges. And Shelford states that organisms are under the influence of a range of factors, not just minimum levels. So they're influenced by too much of something as well as too little. So if we look at any abiotic factor, uh, too little of it, you won't be able to get much of the species, and too much also will produce little. And in the optimum range, there'll be a large amount. It's sometimes called a Goldilocks factor, after the character Goldilocks, who found the porridge of the baby bear just right. So organisms thrive in conditions which are just right. And if the condition is too low or too high, they will suffer. And this is the principle of tolerance limits. Going to look at this in more detail. So populations exhibit a range of tolerance. So this organism can uh, survive in a wide range of a certain factor. Although in certain levels there'll be a zone of stress where you find only a few of the organism. And then you'll find a optimal range where you find a lot of it. So the array of environmental factors such as soil pH, temperature, etc. This concept, which is a corollary of the previous adaptation concept, We've not done the adaptation concept yet. We'll do that later on. Suggests that if the environment changes quickly, either by natural or human causes, the population, or most of the population, will find itself experiencing conditions for which it is not adapted. If there is a sudden change, it will find itself in a period of conditions of stress, and therefore the population might decrease. Uh, and the next part is important. Every population is adapted to multiple ranges of many environmental factors, not just one. So this condition here represents many different factors, which are represented by many different axes. And this is trying to get a hypervolume in a two-dimensional diagram, where it's not just three-dimensional, but uh, many-dimensional, to represent the many factors which are affected. So a more appropriate depiction of this concept would be the sketch onto the right, which shows 7 factors. And this example is much too simplistic. Consider all of this. We continue to be amazed at how organisms fit so well into the relatively narrow ranges of tolerance within relatively narrow ranges of environmental conditions. Um, the fact here is really, as I said, have a wide range of different conditions. And if one or two of them change, then the population of that organism is going to fall drastically. So um, all of those factors have to be just right for the population to thrive. In these times of unprecedented human-caused environmental change, the range of tolerance figure above should be tattooed on every person's forehead. I don't particularly agree to that. But the idea that this is trying to show is that the population can only be correct if all of these factors is towards the optimum condition, and if any one of them falls, the population will drop severely. And humans are changing the environment, and therefore populations of many organisms are going to fall drastically. Then life is found everywhere on the earth, but is not distributed evenly around the planet. Different species are found in different areas, and some have overlapping ranges, others do not. And each species has its set of environmental conditions which it can best survive and reproduce. And these are going to vary from one organism to another. So not surprisingly, these conditions are the ones for which it is best adapted. And many different physical or abiotic factors influence where a species lives, including temperature, humidity, soil chemistry, pH, salinity, and oxygen levels. And of course, it won't be just biotic factors, but it's abiotic, but biotic as well. For example, prey are going to be affected by predators. So if an organism which is a prey can escape, keep away from, live in an area where the predator isn't found, it will probably do so. So just as species have geographical ranges, they also have tolerance ranges for abiotic environmental conditions. In other words, they can tolerate or survive with a certain range of a particular factor, but cannot survive if there is too much or too little of the factor. So we can take temperature for example. Polar bears survive very well at low temperatures or die from overheating in the tropics. So their tolerance range is for very cold climates. On the other hand, giraffes do not do well, does very well in the heat of the African savanna, but will quickly freeze to death in the Arctic. This example points out an important aspect of tolerance ranges. Different types of organisms have different tolerance ranges for the same factor. Factor is temperature. Polar bears thrive in cold conditions. Giraffes thrive in hot conditions. And in fact, the tolerance range of a single individual may change over time. Individuals of certain species of salmon, for example, start life in freshwater stream, migrate to the open ocean, and then come back to their home stream to reproduce. So these salmon tolerate huge changes in salinity of the various waters it passes through during its journey, and experiences many changes in its water temperature. So the point here is the tolerance ranges change during the salmon's life. So over time, as it matures, it begins in fresh water. So its tolerance ranges for uh, water with a low salinity. It then goes into the sea with a high salinity. So its tolerance range has changed. And then it goes to spawn. Its tolerance range again goes to water with a low salinity level. Another important aspect is that all organisms have a tolerance ranges: microbes, fungi, plants, animals, including humans. We know some bacteria are thermophiles and thrive in very hot water. Um, but even humans have tolerance ranges. But say this about humans. While human technology has allowed us to live and work in extreme environments, humans still freeze to death and die from heat stroke, drown, suffocate, and die from exposure to acids or lack of fresh water to drink. So humans have tolerance ranges, conditions where they can thrive, and other conditions where they can't. And tolerance ranges are going to affect where people tend to live. Although I suppose we can say that humans can change the environment, and therefore we can live in areas where we wouldn't normally do so. For example, people live for periods of time in Antarctica, where the temperatures are really cold. So our protective technology and tolerance ranges for too much or too little of these factors only goes so far. Beyond to the tolerance range, we cannot and do not survive. Then, after that, biologists are frequently interested in studying and understanding tolerance ranges of different species for different environmental factors. And if you draw a graph of how many individuals in the population live under which part of the range of any given factor, you almost always get a bell-shaped curve. Yeah, that's a normal distribution curve. For example, for temperature, not too many people are going to be living at temperatures too cold, and not too many people be living at temperatures too high. Take a look at the two tolerance range curves shown below. These ones here. Um, the horizontal axis could be any abiotic factor, uh, and by that we mean environmental condition. but let's say its oxygen levels in freshwater lakes. If you're studying a particular species of fish, let's say the black stripe top minnow, uh, you could go out and measure the oxygen level in every lake where you find the top minnow, and also count how many top minnows are in each lake. When you make a graph of the data, the graph might look like graph 1. That is this one. So they thrive at this environmental condition here. This is optimal region. At low, it's not so good. At high, it's uh, the graph is telling you that the majority of top minnows live in the middle part of the oxygen range. That is where the curve is highest. As you move from the middle part to the lower oxygen levels, or to the higher oxygen levels, the curve is not as high. There are fewer individuals that live in the lakes that have the lower or higher amounts of oxygen. And if the oxygen is extremely low or extremely high, it's beyond the tolerance range, and no top minnows live in those lakes. Now we can look at this one. We can see here that the optimal condition is for a much higher concentration of that environmental factor. So take a look at graph 2, which represents the oxygen tolerance range for a different species of fish, in this case a black-tailed shiner. And we can see that this thrives at a higher oxygen concentration level. What graph 2 is telling us about shiners compared to top minnows. Shiners have a much narrower tolerance range for oxygen than top minnows do. You can also see that this curve is narrower. This one is fairly broad, so this fish can live under a wide range of uh, concentrations of oxygen, whereas this one can only live in a much narrower range, but also its optimal condition is much higher. Um, the shiner can only thrive in a narrow band of oxygen levels, so what you'd expect is the geographical range will be more restricted. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because its tolerance range is less. It would not be distributed as widely as the top minnow, since it would not do well in the stagnant ponds with lower oxygen levels, for example. If you look closely, you'll also notice the peak of the curve for the shiner is a little bit to the right of the peak. This tells us compared to the top minnows, shiners do best in water that is slightly more oxygenated. Then both graph 1 and graph 2 are bell-shaped curves. That's a normal or typical curve you get when graphing tolerance ranges. Yeah, we call it a normal distribution curve. And interestingly enough, curves shaped like this illustrate what is referred to as a normal distribution. In some ways, you could say it is a Goldilocks curve. It shows the conditions are just right for a species. Not too hot, not too cold. Not too salty or not salty enough. Um, not too wet, not too dry. These preferences and needs for certain types of conditions greatly influence the distribution of species around the planet. And it can get fairly complex when you consider the multiple abiotic factors that are simultaneously influencing any given individual species. Then, after that, we need to look at niches. We encountered niche in the last class. A niche can be defined as the means by which a species or an individual interacts with its environment. In other words, a niche identifies the way in which a species lives in its environment and what its role is in the community. There are several different behavioral dimensions of a niche, such as the method of finding food, locomotion, and survival. The temperature limits of environment also define the niche of an organism. Whether above or below certain temperatures, the species will be either unable to survive, as some of the biological activities may be interrupted, worse, may come to a halt. So, what it's saying here is that the niche, the organism can only survive in certain with certain abiotic factors, and these are part of its niche. So the environment also defines the niche of an organism, the temperature and so on. And in ecology, a niche is defined as the response of a biological population to the limiting factors, e.g. the presence of competitors and the distribution of resources. Another example is when a species population increases in number and when there are fewer predators, pathogens or parasites. Thus in such a niche the species will thrive. On the other hand, an increase in the number of predators or the risk of disease caused by parasites and pathogens will result in a decrease of the population of that species. Consequently, the species would have to adapt, for example, by acquiring adaptations that boost immunity against disease, or they will need to be moved to a more favorable environment to sustain their species' existence. The favorable environment will then be the niche of that species. And different definitions of the niche have been defined by scientists, such as the Grinnellian niche, the Eltonian niche, the Hutchinsonian niche. The Grinnellian niche is determined by the habitat in which a species lives and its behavioural adaptations. The Eltonian niche is determined by the relation of a species with food and its enemies in the biotic environment, and the Hudsonian niche is a broader term and attempts to explain why so many species coexist in a similar environment. He also defined the term hypervolume, which means a multi-dimensional space of resources such as nutrients, water, light, and so on. So, when you look at a niche volume, since it contains many different abiotic factors, you form a hypervolume. And the hypervolume is multi-dimensional with no constraints on the dimensions. So Hutchinson described it as an n-dimensional hypervolume. The dimensions of this volume are environmental conditions and resources in which species can coexist and thrive. After that, the most important thing is a realized niche can be defined as the environmental position of that species occupies and lives in. So it's realized in the sense of being real, actual, where the species actually lives. A realized niche is also called a post-competitive. A realized niche is a result of the presence of limiting factors, such as food, light, water, the presence of other species, etc., forcing the species or organism to move to a certain environment where they may thrive. A realized niche, therefore, is defined as a space in the environment where a species is most highly adapted to play its role. So that's a realized niche. The concept of a realized niche can be better understood when comparing it in context to the fundamental niche. Both realized and fundamental niches represent the environmental position of the species in the ecosystem, where the fundamental niche defines the environmental conditions in which the species can live and reproduce. So a fundamental niche is going to be much broader. It's where the species can in fact live, whereas a realized niche is where it actually lives. So this includes both biotic, the presence of food, um, such as grass and other animals in the case of carnivores, and abiotic, temperature, humidity, sunlight, etc. So the realized niche will involve all of those. Hmm. Uh, sorry, the fundamental niche will say where it can actually live. So contain all of these things. A fundamental niche is an ideal condition for a species to thrive without any competition. However, we know that in one habitat there could be multiple species coexisting, and so there will be competition for food, mate, and other limited resources that the population size of the different species coexisting at the same time. And this competition then results in a realized niche. The fundamental niche represents all of the conditions in which species can easily survive and reproduce to continue its generation. The realized niche, on the other hand, is where the species actually live. On Earth, the species have to live in an environment with other species or competitors are present. And apart from competitors, there are other factors such as climate, terrain, and resources that define the position of the species in the environment. And of course, some species will compete with others better in certain conditions, and others will compete better in others. And this will determine their realized niche. If multiple species occupy the same exact niche within their habitat, the competitive exclusion principle could apply. And this basically says that no two species can exit, uh, occupy exactly the same niche at the same time. Uh, if they do, one of them will outcompete the other, and the one will go extinct. So the one which is being outcompeted does is adapt and occupy a slightly different niche so that it can continue to survive. According to this principle, one species will outcompete the others. There will be two options for the outcompeted species, i.e. die out or adapt. And the flexibility in the utilization of resources can allow species to coexist together and avoid competition. In other words, the species have to modify their realized niches to achieve this kind of coexistence. So organisms which initially have the same fundamental niche will adapt themselves so they exhibit different realized niches, and this will lower the competition between the two species. And figure 2 depicts the difference between a fundamental niche and a realized niche, where the possibility of the existence of a species outside the fundamental niche is zero. So notice the realized niche is much narrower than the fundamental niche, and this enables other organisms to occupy different positions, uh, but may occupy part of the same fundamental niche. So the main difference between a fundamental niche and a realized niche is the realized niche is the actual environment where species live, whereas a fundamental niche is the environmental condition in which a species can live. A fundamental niche is also referred to as a pre-competitive niche and is defined by a set of conditions and resources where the species can survive, grow, and reproduce. There is no competition for resources and predators. Thus, a species can take advantage of both biotic and abiotic requirements for the sustained existence in the ecosystem. An example of a fundamental niche is that of the red-winged blackbird. This species dominates the marshes during the early spring. That area becomes a fundamental niche for the red-winged blackbirds. But later on in the year, the tricolored blackbird arrive in the marshes during the summer, and they're more aggressive and as a result occupy more of the best territory. And this is these two birds, the red-winged blackbird and the tricolored blackbird. This one occupies the niche for most of the year, but in the summertime, this bird, a migratory bird, comes into the marshes, and this bird has to move to smaller regions of the marsh, out of the way of this more aggressive bird. And there is a multitude of environmental factors that affect the population existing on the Earth. A realized niche is a post-competitive niche and is considered a sub-branch of a fundamental niche. And the realized niche can change in different conditions and so on. A realized niche is formed in a species when a fundamental niche has to deal with pressures of coexisting with other species in the environment, such as these two birds coexisting. And when this bird comes, this bird has to move to away from it. Um, the species is forced to live in a smaller niche. An example of how a realized niche is formed is a coexistence between wolves and coyotes across North America. Because both species inhabit the same area, coyotes, where they then compete for food and territory. But the realized niche for coyotes was small, due to the more aggressive nature of wolves. But when the European settlers came to the continent hunting and reduced the population of wolves, this favored the coyotes, and thus their realized niche expanded to have a wolf and a coyote. And they occupy similar niches, but the wolf is more aggressive than the coyote, and therefore the wolf occupied a larger area of land. But when people started hunting the wolves and their population decreased, coyotes could occupy more of the land again. And then these are the differences between a realized niche and a fundamental niche. A realized niche is small, whereas a fundamental niche is large. In the realized niche, there is no competition for resources and predators. Uh, for realized niche, for a fundamental niche, there is no competition. But for a realized niche, there is. Limiting factors. For a realized niche, there's a lot of limiting factors present because a viable population of species is coexisting. For a fundamental niche, there are no limiting factors. The environment is ideal. A realized niche is actual, whereas a fundamental niche is an ideal or a theoretical idea. A realized niche is also a post-competitive niche because the organism is competing with others, whereas a fundamental niche is pre-competitive. And that basically completes this discussion.